Okay, so we're going to look at chapters 23, actually, to 28, because I mislabeled that. And in chapter 23, the main thing that happens is that Bob Ewell threatens to get Atticus back one day. And that's kind of the main focus in chapter 23. In chapter 24, the focus is the ladies and they have a tea party. Chapter 25, we learn that Tom has died. Chapter 26, we learn about the Radley place. Boo comes back into the picture, and we also learn about Hitler. Chapter 27 is all about foreshadowing. There's kind of 3 events that occur that are pretty key. And chapter 28, they start out on a journey that ends with Bob Ewell basically dying after he tries to kill Scout and Jem. So just so we know, in chapter 26, Jem is in grade 7 and Scout is in grade 3, and 3 years have passed in the novel since the very first chapter. So that kind of just shows you how the children are growing, and there is a logical amount of time that is occurring through this as well. So Jem is really confused after the trial. He's confused by the result of the trial. He starts to see the reality of the world around him, and he tries to teach Scout and Dill about this new reality and the hardships in the world. He is definitely worried, but does admire Atticus for his lack of fear. The children suggest that Atticus carry a gun, and Atticus responds, "Nonsense." And that just shows, again, like that kind of moral and righteousness that is within Atticus. He doesn't think that a gun is going to solve anything, nor is he the individual to start a fight or to continue to fight with his fists, right? He is much too civilized and mature for that. And Jem also starts to realize that there are many good people in the town, but a lot of them are simply too afraid of being on a jury or too afraid of getting involved. And he decides that he is going to be different. So he definitely learns to cope with this new reality through action. He refuses to be like others in the town, and he decides to be a different individual, and he's very courageous because of this. He is definitely cynical when they learn that Tom was shot. Now, Tom is shot when he attempts to escape prison, but he has only one good arm and is unable to climb a fence. So, in a sense, Tom did choose the way to die because he felt that he knew he was going to be convicted, and likely he would have been condemned to death in the electric chair, which is a horrifying, extremely painful death where they electrocute you. And you do feel a great deal of pain. That was outlawed, obviously, in the later years, but in this time period, that is a reality. And he avoids that by basically having them shoot him instead. Now, the fact that they shoot him 17 times shows how unnecessary that is. And that kind of violence does make Jem very cynical. But he takes this in stride, and he does try to become a leader for Scout. He holds his head high. He protects his sister and fights with Bob Ewell. He tells Scout to run, and he attempts to save his sister and also be a leader of that through examples. So some symbols and motif. We see the roly-poly bug, and Jem won't let Scout harm the bug because it's not harming her, and he stops her from stepping on it. This is a parallel then in chapter 26 when we see Helen Robinson, and he talks about Atticus telling her that her husband has died, and he says she just fell down like a giant with a big foot just came along and stepped on her, like you would step on an ant. And again, it compares the African-American individuals to being powerless, to being tiny, and other people harming them for no reason. And that parallels the idea of Scout harming the bug because it's in her way, even though he's not doing any harm to her. And that's where Jem is more mature and coming of age. And we see him trying to teach his sister what is right. We also hear about the mockingbird in terms of Tom dying. Mr. Underwood, who he himself is a fairly racist individual, does write a column and says that it is a sin to kill cripples, and he likened Tom's death to the senseless slaughter of songbirds by hunters and children. And that songbird represents that mockingbird. And the idea it's a sin to kill a mockingbird, it's a sin to kill something that has done no harm to you. And in that epitome is Tom, who is represented by the mockingbird. But he's not the only one. When the children go to the affair at the school, they talk about walking past the Radley house, and high above us in the darkness, a solitary mocker poured his repetition in blissful unawareness. And that mockingbird is sitting in Boo Radley's tree. And that represents the second individual who will be represented as a mockingbird. So there's a lot of foreshadowing here. We see in chapter 23 Bob's threat to kill Atticus. That's because he lost face, even though he won the trial, and he wants revenge because the town folk do not believe him. They supported him out of racial division, but they do not believe him. The Cunninghams as well. We learned that the reason the jury was out so long was that one of the men from the mob was arguing for Atticus. And he gained a lot of respect that night for Atticus and his children. And he was actually arguing that perhaps Atticus was correct and to acquit Tom. So it's interesting because, again, a negative individual from the Cunninghams who were going to lynch Tom in the beginning had changed his opinion and changed his mind. And that shows kind of those power of the words that the children had, and Atticus and how he can affect change just by his leading by example. We also learn about Boo Radley, the idea that perhaps he stays inside because of hatred in the world, and something is going to happen in the next couple of chapters that's going to cause him to come outside. And Bob Ewell, he talks about when Tom Robinson dies, 1 down and about 2 more to go. Yeah, sometimes I miss the letters at the end of words. Sorry. And the 2 that he has to go is Judge Taylor, because he made Bob look like a fool in the trial, and Atticus, because the town believes Atticus. And in chapter 23, we have 3 more events that lead up to this. Bob Ewell is fired from his job. Someone breaks into Judge Taylor's house. It is strongly suggested that that is Bob Ewell. And Helen, Tom Robinson's wife, was being kind of harassed by Bob Ewell. And Tom worked for Link D's, and he gives Helen a job, and he also comes and defends her. And he says to Bob Ewell that he needs to stay away from Helen and not interfere with her, or he will make him regret it. So the town does kind of rally around the remnants of this family to support them. I'm just going to do themes first. So 2 major themes in this moment is the loss of innocence and coming of age. So for Scout, there's definitely some loss of innocence here. She is growing up, not quite as much as Jem, but she is growing up. She gains some sympathy for Boo when they talk about maybe he wants to stay inside, and she's no longer afraid of the Radley house. She feels sympathy. She feels a twinge of remorse about how they tried to get Boo out. But some childishness still remains when she says, "But I still looked for him each time I went by." And it's also interesting because we learn more about Atticus and see that he is very godlike. He reveals that he actually knew about the pants all along, that he knew that they were trying to like sneak into the house and see him. And it just shows that he's a good parent, that he protects the children and kind of guides them. He doesn't reprimand them when he feels they don't need it. We also see Scout losing some innocence when she tries to fight Bob Ewell, but Jem protects her. Scout's worried about Jem, especially in chapter 28. So we do see there's some childishness there. She keeps asking if Jem has died. She asks about 4 or 5 people, but it's actually Bob Ewell who has died. And there is a little bit of foreshadowing before that too in chapter 27. At the very end, it says, "Thus began the longest journey together." And that's the journey that is talked about in chapter 1 as well. And it talks about how they said this all began when Jem broke his arm, and then they had a discussion and thought, no, it began much further before that, before the trial. And that kind of brings us back into chapter 1. So this is a good moment to read chapter 1 and kind of see some of those clues being laid out. Coming of age, this especially focuses on Jem. Atticus tells him, when it's a white man's word against a black man's word, the white man always wins. They're ugly, but those are the facts of life. And that idea is that people forget inequality as they age. And Jem fights against that. So Jem connects Tom's death to the injustice in the world. Scout still struggles to understand everything, but she too is coming of age. Scout and Jem, they talk about how they act like a gentleman and a lady. That is because they don't give into the gossip, especially at school, and they don't get into fistfights. They are more mature. They are more older than they were at the beginning, right? Scout had a hard time not fighting people, and here they both rise above that and lead by example. There is another important moment in terms of gender, because it kind of undercuts the entire novel. Women can't be on a jury, and Atticus agrees with this. This is good because although Atticus appears to be almost a perfect individual in the novel, this shows he is biased. He's not perfect. He does have flaws. He makes even a joke about how, oh, the women might talk too much on the jury. So he is biased against women in some regard. He respects them, but still has that bias that they couldn't do the same work as a man. So it does highlight a good factor that Atticus is not an idealized character. He does have some faults as well. So, fear. We're going to go up because I want to explain more about the other stuff. So, fear. There's lots of moments of fear. Bob spits on Atticus and vows to get him. When we talk about Tom Robinson, and the comment was, Tom was a dead man the minute Mayella Ewell opened her mouth and screamed. And that is that harsh reality for sure. And that is the hardship that the children deal with. And also comes back to the idea that we can't pity Mayella Ewell completely because Tom is dead because of her actions. There's a lot of fear at the end when they know that someone is following him. And Scout, Jem was talking in an unhurried, flat, toneless voice. He knows that someone is there and he's trying not to panic Scout. And then at the end, the dull crunching sound and Jem screamed. And at that moment, Scout is terrified herself. Irony. So there's a couple of different moments of irony. One, it's interesting to note that Atticus does lose the case with Tom Robinson and yet is elected to the state legislature. That is because the town believes in him and they recognize that he is better than them. They're not quite ready, but it comes back to another comment that Miss Maudie made with the idea of it's not a full step, it's maybe just a baby step, but it's a step all the same. And the idea is that they're trying to step in the right direction. They're trying to rectify the wrongs in the past. There's another moment of irony when they talk about Hitler in school, and they explain how evil he is, how he's persecuting the Jews, and how the US is much better than Germany because they don't persecute anyone depending on their religion, which is really interesting because the Jews are seen as white. And Scout and Jem are the ones who recognize the irony here. Okay. So there's definitely a lot of irony here in terms of the inability for people in the US to see that they are doing the same thing. They're just persecuting a different group of people. It doesn't matter if you don't persecute one group of people, if you're persecuting another group of people. So there is a lot of hypocrisy, and this is especially seen in chapter 24. It's really interesting because when I first read chapter 24 and I was in grade 10, I thought it was really boring. That was the truth. But as I started to teach it, I realized that chapter 24 is one of the most important chapters because it really highlights that subtle racism that is ingrained within society. So they, at the Tea Party, talk about how Tom's death is newsworthy only for 2 days. And once he dies, they say it's typical, you know how they are, easy come, easy go. They say he was clean and married, but the N-word always comes out at the end. You should feel upset when you read these comments. It is incensing you to feel some sort of emotion. It shows that the town, especially the women, have no sympathy or empathy. It's infantilization when they talk about them as if they are children, talking about a whole group of adults as children. Prejudice, that subtle racism that undercuts the society, and that discrimination that exists. And it's really interesting because they, again, hide behind religion as well. They act very righteous. They say Helen needs to go to church more, and then use race. The women, the white women, will forgive the African Americans for their disobedience or a fact that they are upset that Tom Robinson has died. And one woman says about to her maid Sophie, "Sophie, you simply aren't being a Christian today." We have another woman, Miss Merriweather, that says, "We can educate them to make Christians out of them, but there's no lady safe in her bed these nights." And again, you should feel anger at these moments. It is very hypocritical. These women are talking down to a group of people without any idea of what they're saying, and then are hiding behind religion and saying that they themselves are righteous individuals. And the people who stand up to this is Miss Maudie, who kind of makes them eat their words. She changes their opinion to some regard that they need to keep their mouths closed and keep their opinions to themselves, as does Aunt Alexandra. And it's this moment that really impacts Scout, because she thinks that if Aunt Alexandra can be a lady in a time like this, and she sees Miss Maudie being a lady as well, that she thinks maybe she too can be a lady, and she sees it in a positive light because of those two role models. Now, it's interesting to think, why are the women more prejudiced, perhaps, compared to the men? And when you think about it, we have to come back to that idea of who has power. And here we see that the men are above the women. The only people the women can complain about are people below them on the social rung, which in this case would be anyone in the African American community. So again, we see that the people take advantage of people who are below them, just like Mayella Ewell. The only person for her to take advantage of in order to escape facing what she did is someone who is African American, because she was further down here, right? So that's the problem. And that's one of the reasons why they act out. They cannot go against anyone up here. And so they must act out their anger or any issues with someone who have less power than them. Also interesting to note, like, women are less educated, right? They don't go to school as long. They don't have necessarily the same background. They wouldn't go to higher education. So a lot of it is also ignorance. And again, the author is pulling out religion and showing how people manipulate it for their own purposes. Okay, so those are chapters 23 to 28.